Hello, bonjour, it's Laura here. In this video, we're actually going to do some calculations now to figure out what the limiting reactant is. So there's a few simple things to remember when we're doing these calculations. To find the limiting reactant, the quickest, easiest way to do this is to calculate how many moles of product could be formed for each of the reactants. So say you have 2 or 3 reactants in a chemical equation and you're trying to figure out which one is the limiting reactant, you have to do those calculations for every single one of those. And then the way that you figure out the limiting reactant is it's the one that produces the smallest number of moles. Okay, so remember we do know how to figure out the grams of moles produced, but we're just going to stop, or the grams of a compound produced, but we're just going to stop at moles because then we don't have to do as many calculations. All right, so here's an example of a question. So we've got 4 moles of hydrogen gas and 2 moles of chloride gas are mixed. How many moles of hydrogen chloride would be formed, and what is the limiting reactant? Okay, so the first thing that I like to do with a question like this, because often you'll be told how much you have of each of the reactants, so I like to write all of that underneath of the chemical equation. So we know that we've got 4 moles of the hydrogen gas, so that's right here. And then we know that we've got 2 moles of the chloride, and so I've written that right there. And then what the question's asking is how many moles of the product are formed, and then we want to figure out what's the limiting reactant as well. So what we need to do is, as always, state the given and the needed moles. But now we can do that for both reactants. So what we're given is 4 moles of the hydrogen gas, and we're also given 2 moles of the chloride gas. And then what we need is we need to figure out the moles of the hydrogen chloride. And we'll also need to figure out what the limiting reactant is. So what we want to do is write a plan to convert the given into the needed moles. So what we would do if we're trying to go from moles of the hydrogen gas to the moles of the hydrogen chloride is we'll use just a mole ratio. Because we're not dealing with grams of our reactant or grams of our product. We already know the moles of our reactant, so all we have to do is one conversion to get that information. And then we can do the same thing with the moles of the chlorine gas to getting to the moles of the hydrogen gas. So we're going to use our mole ratio, or our mole to mole factor. All right, so then we can execute our plan. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to use the coefficients from our reaction to write our mole ratios. So 1 mole of the hydrogen gas is going to produce 2 moles of the hydrogen chloride, and then those would be the ratios from that. And now let's go back to the equation here as well. 1 mole of the chloride here is going to produce 2 moles of the HCl as well. So we'll write that conversion factor also. So 1 mole of the chlorine gas will produce 2 moles of the hydrogen chloride. Okay, and we can make conversion factors from that as well. So then the step 4 is calculate the moles of each product from each of the reactants. So we're going to have to do 2 conversions, 1 for hydrogen gas, 1 for chlorine gas. And then we're going to select the number of moles the smaller number, and that will be the limiting reactant. So here's the calculation for our hydrogen gas. So we know we've got 4 moles of the hydrogen gas to start. Then we've got our molar ratio here, and that comes from the balanced equation, and that will produce 8 moles of the hydrogen chloride. Then we do the exact same thing for the chlorine gas. We know that we started with 2 moles of the chlorine gas, and there's our molar ratio, so that's 2 to 1. And that's going to produce 4 moles of the HCl. So notice this is the smaller number, okay? And then, so the smaller number that is produced, so that's the smaller number produced comes from the chlorine gas. So that means that the chlorine gas is the limiting reactant. So that's a simple way to do that. What you want to do is, of course, you want to do everything as simply and quickly, most efficiently as possible. So if you're starting your question with moles, the question gives you moles of your reactant, then find out the moles of the product. If your question gives you grams of your reactants, then you need to go from grams of your reactant to moles of your reactant, then figure out the moles of the product, and then just stop there. Unless the question asks you otherwise, stop at the moles, because that's enough information to tell you what the limiting reactant is. Okay, well done, miigwech.